Have you ever found yourself thinking about a place from long ago? A place that seemed to hold the rhythm of your heart in its stillness? Somewhere so quiet that even the smallest ripple in the water felt like a secret being shared. There is such a place tucked away in the folds of the countryside, a pond that glimmers in the light of late afternoon, and an old willow tree whose branches have swayed through countless seasons. If you sit beneath it, you can almost hear the years passing in the soft hush of its leaves. And if you close your eyes, perhaps you'll remember a version of yourself that the world has long forgotten. Tonight, we'll walk there together. We'll take the winding path through fields and fences, follow the sound of water, and step into that quiet space where time slows. The air is cool and sweet, and the gentle presence of the willow seems to watch over us. So, if you're ready, let's begin our slow journey toward Miller's Pond. There is a certain hour in late afternoon when the light falls softer, as if the day itself is taking a long, deep breath before surrendering to the quiet of evening. It was in such an hour that Thomas began his walk toward Miller's Pond. The air carried the kind of coolness that spoke of autumn, a faint sharpness in the breeze, and the scent of dry leaves settling into the earth. The path was not a straight one, and that was part of its charm. It wound its way through a stretch of meadow, past a weathered split-rail fence that had stood there longer than Thomas could remember. The rails were silvered by sun and rain, each one lined with the fine, intricate work of lichen, little constellations of pale green clinging to the wood. He let his hand brush against them as he passed, feeling the roughness beneath his fingertips, the way the grain rose and fell in soft ridges. Somewhere nearby, a windmill turned lazily, its blades creaking in a rhythm that seemed older than the village itself. The sound carried across the fields like a voice you hadn't heard in years, but could still recognize instantly. It made Thomas slow his steps, not out of fatigue, but out of the simple wish to let the moment last a little longer. To his left, the land opened wide, and the stubbled remains of a hayfield lay golden under the low sun. Stray stalks leaned at odd angles, catching the light as if they, too, wanted to hold on to this final warmth before the frost came. Beyond the field, a stand of oaks rose tall, their leaves already shifting toward bronze and deep russet. The trees stood in a quiet cluster, like old friends leaning close to hear one another over the hush of the wind. It had been many years since Thomas had walked this way. Life had pulled him in other directions, toward cities where the nights were never truly dark, and the days passed in a restless hurry. But the memory of this path, of the way it curved toward the pond, and of the willow that waited there, had remained with him like a thread he could follow back whenever he needed to remember who he was. A pair of crows lifted from the fence ahead, their wings cutting dark shapes against the pale sky. They called to each other as they moved toward the woods, their voices echoing in the stillness. Thomas watched them go until they were just specks over the trees. There was no reason to rush. Here, every small thing, a bird's flight, the bend of grass, the way the light lay across a field, felt worth noticing. The road underfoot was a mix of gravel and packed earth, and each step made a muted crunch. In places, the surface was softened by a scatter of fallen leaves, their edges curled and brittle. Some were caught in little eddies of wind, lifting briefly before drifting back down, as if they, too, were reluctant to leave the ground that had held them all summer. He came to a bend where the land dipped slightly, and there, the sound of water began to thread its way into the air. It, was faint, just the smallest murmur, but it stirred something in him, the way a certain song can carry you back years in an instant. The creek that fed Miller's pond ran along the far side of this hollow, hidden now by brush and tall grass, but its voice was there, steady and low, keeping pace with his steps. Thomas paused at the edge of a wooden gate, its hinges worn but still strong. He leaned on it for a moment, looking out at the slope beyond. This was the last stretch before the pond, and from here the path narrowed, becoming less a road and more a trail, worn by generations of quiet walkers. He could almost see them, neighbors long gone, children carrying pails, lovers strolling slowly in the kind of silence that needs no filling. A few yards ahead, the air changed. It grew cooler, touched with the dampness of water close by. The scent of moss and wet stone rose up, and beneath it, the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Not unpleasant, but rich and grounding, like the earth itself was breathing. Somewhere in the branches above, a late-season warbler called, its note clear and solitary against the hushed background. Thomas's pace slowed again, though he was already moving gently. It was not that he feared the day would end too soon. It was that he wished to arrive at the pond as one arrives at a long-awaited conversation, not abruptly, but with the care it deserves. He let his eyes wander to the edges of the trail, where ferns grew in small, bright clusters, and the ground was littered with acorns fallen from the oaks. Each one held the shape of a season now nearly past, a small promise folded tight inside. Through a gap in the trees, a flicker of silver appeared, just a glint of water catching the sun. It was gone in the next step, hidden again by the curve of the trail, but it was enough to draw a quiet smile to his face. Miller's pond was near. The willow would be there, its branches swaying gently over the water as they always had. The path dipped once more, and the sound of the creek grew stronger, a patient, unending voice. Somewhere ahead, it widened into the stillness of the pond. Thomas took a slow breath, the kind that fills not just the lungs but something deeper, and stepped forward, the light falling around him in soft golden sheets. The trail narrowed until it was little more than a soft ribbon of earth, worn smooth by many quiet seasons of footsteps. The air grew still here, sheltered by a ring of tall trees whose branches met high above, weaving together in a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into slow-moving patterns across the ground. Thomas felt the temperature drop just slightly, a coolness that touched his cheeks and carried with it the faint scent of water and earth. It was the kind of air that made you instinctively slow your breathing, as if the forest itself asked for a quieter kind of presence. A few more steps, and the pond revealed itself, not with any sudden grandeur, but in the gentle way that familiar places often do. The water stretched out before him, its surface so still that the reflection of the sky seemed as solid as the sky itself. A thin band of reeds lined the far shore, their dry stalks whispering together when the smallest breeze passed through. And there, at the pond's edge, where the ground sloped gently toward the water, stood the willow tree. It was just as he remembered, though time had added its own marks. A thicker trunk now, more deeply furrowed, its roots rising in places like the backs of resting animals before slipping under the dark water. From those roots the trunk rose and then bent slightly toward the pond, as if drawn by the mirror it had leaned over for decades. Branches fell in long, loose curtains, the leaves catching what light remained and letting it sift down in a soft green shimmer. Thomas stopped a few paces back, taking in the sight without hurry. He could feel the years in it, years in which the tree had stood through storms and summers, through the turning of leaves and the silent freezing of the pond in winter. It had been here when he was a boy, and it would be here, most likely, when he was gone. There was a kind of comfort in that thought, the way certain things remain steadfast in a world that moves too quickly. He walked to the base of the tree, his boots making almost no sound on the damp earth. The grass here was soft, thick in some places and worn bare in others where the roots came up to greet the air. Kneeling, he pressed a hand to the bark, cool, rich, and alive in a way that pulsed quietly beneath the skin of the tree. It was not the kind of life that called for notice, but the kind that endures simply by being. Settling himself with his back against the trunk, Thomas let his body ease into the curve it offered. The tree seemed to accept his weight without complaint, as if it had been waiting for this reunion. From here, the view of the pond was a slow and generous one. A heron standing motionless near the reeds, the faint ring on the water where a fish had surfaced and vanished, the drifting of a single yellow leaf that had broken free and now moved wherever the water wished to carry it. His eyes wandered over the far bank to the gentle rise of land where the meadow met the edge of the woods. In the distance, the roof of the old Miller house just barely showed above the tree line, its chimney sending up a pale thread of smoke. That house had been part of his earliest memories of this place. Afternoons when his father would bring him here, sometimes to fish, sometimes just to sit and let the world settle around them. He remembered the rough texture of the picnic blanket, the weight of a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and the quiet, always the quiet, that seemed to open wide over the pond. Now, sitting here as a man, he found that same quiet waiting for him. It was not an emptiness, but a fullness without noise, the kind of silence that has shape and texture, woven from the small and constant sounds of the natural world. The faint trickle of the creek as it joined the pond, the occasional rustle of leaves overhead, the distant, almost imperceptible hum of insects preparing for night. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, not to sleep yet, but to let the sounds move through him without the distraction of sight. With his eyes shut, he could feel the subtle movement of the air against his skin, the slight give of the earth beneath him, and the way the tree's trunk seemed to hold him upright without effort. There was a scent here he hadn't realized he'd missed, something between damp wood and the faint sweetness of willow leaves. It wrapped around him the way a memory sometimes does, unexpected and complete. When he opened his eyes again, the sun had shifted lower, and the light on the pond had changed to a softer gold. Shadows lengthened across the water, and the reflection of the willow's branches seemed to reach farther out, touching the image of the sky. A pair of ducks glided past, their passage leaving behind two thin, perfect lines that trailed away until the water smoothed itself again. He thought about how many times this scene had played out without him, how many evenings had come and gone here, unwitnessed by his eyes but held nonetheless in the quiet ledger of the place. It was humbling in a way that felt gentle rather than sharp. The pond did not need him to remember it, and yet it welcomed him back without question. Reaching into his coat pocket, Thomas drew out a small notebook. Its pages were creased from years of being carried and only occasionally used. He did not open it to write just yet. Instead, he held it in his lap, a simple gesture of readiness should the right words come. Sometimes, he thought, The act of being present was all the note-taking a place required. He let his gaze drift once more to the far shore, watching as the last light caught in the reeds. The breeze shifted, bringing with it the faintest ripple across the pond, enough to stir the willow's reflection into a shimmering, as if the tree and its mirror image were greeting one another after a long day apart. Somewhere behind him, a twig snapped under the weight of a small animal, a squirrel perhaps, or a rabbit making its cautious way toward the water. The sound was brief, and soon the stillness returned, settling over him like a second skin. Thomas stayed there, unmoving except for the slow rhythm of his breathing, until the light began to dim in earnest. The day was easing toward evening, but there was no sense of urgency here, only the knowledge that he could remain as long as he wished, and that the pond, the willow, and this quiet hour would hold him exactly as he was. The quiet around the pond had a way of loosening the knots in Thomas's thoughts. It didn't happen all at once. Rather, it was as if the stillness here knew better than to rush him. The mind, like the surface of the water, needed time to smooth itself. He leaned back once more against the willow's trunk, letting his eyes fall to half closed, and soon the present began to braid itself with the past, one strand of memory slipping quietly into another. It was a summer afternoon, years ago. The air had been heavy with the sweetness of clover and the warm, resinous scent of sunlit pine. He remembered being small enough that the grass, left uncut along the edges of the meadow, rose to his shoulders in places, and brushing against it left faint streaks of green across his arms. His father walked ahead of him on the path, a wicker basket swinging from one hand, the other occasionally reaching back to steady Thomas over the uneven ground. The willow tree had been younger then, its trunk slimmer, its bark smoother, but even in those days it carried the same patient grace. Its branches draped into the water, each leaf moving with the current as though the tree were breathing. Thomas had found it magical, the way the leaves whispered when the breeze caught them, the way the dappled light made the pond's surface seem like a shifting mosaic. His father had set down the basket on a patch of grass and spread a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar from the chest it was stored in. They had eaten in an unhurried way, thick slices of bread, sharp cheese wrapped in paper, apple slices that grew sweeter as the day warmed. Thomas could recall the exact feel of the bread crust between his teeth, the faint salt of the cheese on his tongues, and the sound of his father's voice, low and even, speaking of nothing in particular, letting the pauses fill with the pond's own language. Afterward, they had skipped stones. Thomas had been clumsy at it at first, sending more stones straight into the water with a heavy plunk than he sent skipping, but his father had shown him how to choose the right ones, flat and smooth, cool to the touch, and how to flick the wrist so the stone would catch the air just so before meeting the water. He remembered the thrill of his first true skip, how it danced twice, 3 times across the pond before sinking. The sound had been soft, but in his young ears it rang like a small victory. That day, they had stayed until the shadows of the willow stretched long across the water. On the walk back, the air had cooled, and Thomas had held his father's hand, his legs tired, but his mind filled with the slow, certain joy of having been somewhere that asked nothing of him. It was a joy that asked for no proof, no achievement, only the willingness to sit, to listen, and to belong to the moment. The memory faded gently, not as if it were gone, but as if it had been set back in its place on the shelf of his mind. When Thomas opened his eyes fully, The present returned without any jolt, like waking from a nap and finding the room just as you left it. The willow was here, the pond was here, and he was here. The same boy in ways that counted, though the years between then and now were long and filled with roads far from this one. A breeze moved through, carrying the smell of water and the faint mineral tang of the mud at the pond's edge. The ripples it made were small, barely shifting the reflection of the clouds above. The sound of the leaves overhead was a soft, uneven murmur, like a language spoken too quietly to fully understand, but clear enough to comfort. Thomas reached for a small twig that had fallen beside him and drew idle lines in the soil. They meant nothing, but the motion of making them was steadying, a reminder that he was not here to accomplish anything. In a life full of tasks, this was perhaps the rarest kind of time that existed for itself alone. Somewhere across the pond, a fish leapt, breaking the surface in a brief flash of silver. The circles it made moved outward, slow and widening, until they touched the far bank and disappeared into the stillness again. He watched until the last of them faded, then let his gaze drift upward to the tangle of branches above. The light had shifted to that in-between shade, not yet dusk, but touched by it, as though the day was beginning to wrap itself in a softer fabric. The greens of the leaves were deepening, and the gold on the water had taken on a cooler edge. It was a signal, not to leave, but to lean more fully into the quiet, to settle in as the world slowed around him. He thought of how many evenings like this the willow had seen, how many summers it had welcomed with open branches, how many autumns it had watched pass in a drift of color. It stood as it always had, not untouched by time, but made beautiful by it. There was a lesson in that, though Thomas did not try to name it. Some truths worked best when left to the heart's keeping rather than the mind's. He closed his eyes again, this time letting them stay shut. The sounds became sharper in the darkness behind his lids. The faint lap of water, the creak of a branch shifting in the breeze, the whisper of grass against grass. His breathing matched the rhythm of those sounds, each inhale drawing in the smell of earth and leaf, each exhale sending it back in a slow offering. And somewhere between the pull of memory and the hold of the present, he felt a kind of peace settle, the kind that didn't depend on understanding, only on being here, with the willow, with the pond, and the gentle company of the evening. The afternoon had been quietly folding itself into evening for some time, though Thomas had not noticed at first. It was not the kind of change that announced itself suddenly, but one that moved like a slow tide, imperceptible until you realized the shore of the day had shifted beneath your feet. From where he sat beneath the willow, the air felt just a touch cooler than before, and the colors around him had begun to soften. The gold that had glimmered on the pond's surface earlier was now threaded with silver, as if the water had borrowed a little of the moon's light before night had fully come. The reflection of the sky carried more blue in it now, a deeper hue that seemed to invite quiet, the kind of quiet that made you want to sit closer to the ground and listen. The willow's branches swayed just enough to make the leaves murmur together, their edges catching the dimming light for a moment before releasing it back into the shadows. A small family of ducks had gathered near the far bank, moving in a gentle V across the pond. The water parted cleanly around them, only to meet again in soft ripples that reached the shore in long, patient waves. Thomas watched them, his gaze tracing the line they made, and thought of how the pond seemed to hold each motion as carefully as it held the stillness. Nothing here was hurried, and because of that, nothing felt as though it might be lost. Somewhere to his right, in the fringe of reeds, a red-winged blackbird gave a short, sharp call, not urgent, but as if marking the moment. Its voice hung in the air a second longer than seemed possible, and then the gentle chorus of the pond returned, the light tapping of water against roots, the occasional plop of a fish breaking the surface, the faint rustle of dry grass beyond the path. Thomas let his eyes wander to the edge of the sky where the first pale star had appeared. It was faint now, easy to miss if you weren't looking, but he knew that in another hour the sky would be filled with them. He thought of the nights he had spent here as a boy, lying on his back in the grass while fireflies stitched light through the darkness, and how the stars had seemed endless then, not just in number but in the promise they carried. The air shifted again, bringing with it a faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the trees. It mixed with the scent of damp earth and water, forming a kind of perfume that was unique to this hour, in this place. He drew it in deeply, letting it settle into him the way one might pull a blanket over their shoulders. The smell alone could have told him where he was, and he found himself grateful for the way certain scents hold their ground against time. At the base of the willow, their roots curled and twisted, some disappearing into the pond, others rising high enough from the earth to form small pockets where leaves had gathered. A few of those leaves shifted suddenly, and Thomas caught the quick movement of a frog, its green back blending so perfectly with its surroundings that it seemed to vanish again almost instantly. The moment was brief, but it felt like a secret shared only with him, and he smiled without meaning to. Overhead, a thin line of geese appeared, their dark forms cutting diagonally across the sky. Their calls came in waves, one after another, until they had passed beyond hearing. He watched them go, remembering how, as a child, he used to imagine the conversations they must have been having in flight, long discussions about where to stop, which way to turn, and whether the pond below might be worth a visit. As the light lowered further, the pond took on a mirror-like calm, broken only by the smallest of movements. The willow's reflection deepened in color, its branches darker, its form stretching across the water like the shadow of something ancient and watchful. Thomas could see the faint shimmer of insects skimming just above the surface, and the occasional dart of a fish catching one. The sounds of the day were thinning now, making room for the voices of the evening. The first tentative calls of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl marking the start of its watch. He stayed seated, feeling the weight of the day slip away in layers. Each passing minute seemed to loosen another knot he hadn't known was there. There was no rush to stand, no thought of what came next, only the pull of this moment, steady and sure as the roots beneath him. Somewhere deep in the trees, a soft wind began to move, and the sound of it came to him like a low sigh, traveling through the branches before settling in the willow's leaves. The rhythm of it reminded him of the long afternoons in his youth when he would nap here, lulled by nothing more than this same wind and the warmth of the sun. It occurred to him that some things do not lose their power simply because you have grown older. If anything, they grow more precious. The last edge of sunlight slipped behind the trees on the far shore, and a faint glow began to rise where the moon would soon appear. Thomas tilted his head back to catch the changing light through the branches above. The spaces between the leaves framed the sky in shifting shapes, as though the tree itself were showing him pieces of the night bit by bit, so that he could adjust gently to its coming. He drew his knees up slightly, resting his arms on them, and let his gaze drift without focus across the pond, The stillness was no longer just around him. It had made its way into him, settling in the spaces that had been restless when he arrived. And in that stillness, he felt something close to gratitude. Not just for the willow or the pond, but for the rare gift of a place where nothing is demanded, and all that is asked is that you be here, and let the day go as it will. Thomas lingered under the willow a little longer, listening to the last sounds of afternoon. The light had withdrawn from the surface of the pond, leaving it in a deep, velvety blue, with only a few threads of silver where the moon had begun to touch the water. The air around him seemed to hold its breath, that particular stillness which comes when the sun is gone and night is on its way. He turned slightly, resting his palm against the cool ridged bark of the willow one more time. The tree stood as a long-trusted friend, keeping watch over the pond without urgency, without asking him to stay or to leave, only letting him choose the moment himself. Slowly, he rose, brushing the damp earth from his trousers. Ahead was the narrow path that traced the water's edge. It was not a proper trail, just a low strip where the grass grew thin, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Each step brought him closer to the pond's breathing. Long, even breaths broken only by the smallest ripples or the quiet splash of a fish. Darkness had not yet fully arrived, but it had already found its place in the deeper pockets between the trees. Above, the sky still held a faint band of light, the edge of day giving way to night, washed in a blend of deep blue and pale gold, as though painted in the final strokes of a careful hand. The moon had risen above the eastern tree line, round and bright, scattering silver across the shifting branches. Along the shore, tall grasses leaned toward him, rustling softly in the evening air. Closer to the water, the reeds stood in close company, their tassels trembling gently whenever a breeze passed through. He paused more than once, drawn to the sight of the moon's reflection stretched out across the pond. It was never perfectly still. The image swayed with the water, sometimes breaking apart entirely when a fish surfaced, sending circles outward into the silver. That sight carried him back to other nights long ago, summer evenings when he and a handful of boyhood friends sat here with their fishing poles, their voices low so as not to wake the village houses already asleep. The world had seemed no larger than the pond's soft ring of moonlight, and every story they told was carried away by the ripples. As he moved along, the scent of night by the water grew stronger. Cool, plant-like notes from the lily pads and reeds, the faint mineral tang of damp soil, and, somewhere far off, the sweet drift of wood smoke. Together they formed a fragrance that was both familiar and grounding, a scent that belonged to this place alone. Near a small bend in the shore, he slowed for the sight of a lone maple tree, its leaves already turned to gold. In the moonlight, that gold became something softer, as if the tree glowed from within. A few leaves detached and drifted down, floating on the water for a while before slipping into the shadow of the reeds. Further along, close to the tree line, a deer stepped quietly into view, lowering its head to drink. It moved so silently that Thomas almost doubted it was there, a presence as delicate as a breath. The deer lifted its head, ears twitching, and then walked back into the darkness of the trees, carrying its stillness with it. He went on, now and then bending to pick up a rounded stone from the damp soil. He turned each one over in his hand, feeling the smoothness shaped by years in the water. He did not throw them. Instead, he slipped them into his pocket, a quiet way of keeping the night with him. The path curved, bringing him slowly back toward the willow. From here, its canopy was a dark, graceful curtain, reaching down to touch the pond. He stopped in the very place where he had been sitting earlier, and it felt as though more than an afternoon had passed. Though his walk had taken him only in a circle, he carried within him a new night, a night of moonlight and wind and small, precise movements that could only be seen by those who had slowed enough to notice. Thomas sat again beneath the willow, not from weariness, but from the desire to stay until night had wrapped itself fully around the pond. Somewhere in the village, lamplight would already be warming kitchen walls, and the voices of evening conversations would be carrying softly through windows. But here, by the pond, he was inside a different kind of story, one told without words, where leaves and water spoke in whispers, and the stillness itself was a shelter, holding him in a space where the heart could breathe a little easier. Night had now taken its place, fully and without haste. It did not arrive like a sudden curtain falling, but more like the steady deepening of a tide, each minute bringing a little more darkness, a little more quiet, until the day's colors had dissolved into the soft tones of evening. From beneath the willow, Thomas could see the first full scattering of stars. They were not yet sharp and cold, but still carried a faint warmth from the day, as if the light they gave had just begun its long journey through the cooling air. The moon, bright and whole above the eastern tree line, cast a silver road across the pond, and it seemed almost possible to walk upon it, straight into the reflection of the sky. The branches of the willow framed portions of that view, letting the stars appear in small moving windows between the leaves. When the wind stirred, those windows shifted and new constellations appeared, where a moment before there had been only darkness. He found himself leaning back, head resting against the trunk, letting his gaze wander from one patch of sky to another, as though he were paging slowly through an old familiar book. Somewhere in that drifting gaze, a memory began to take shape, the kind that rises not because you summon it, but because the air and the hour make room for it to return. It was a night much like this one, many years ago. He had been small enough then to fit easily under his father's arm as they walked from the village to the pond. The air had been cooler, the season leaning toward autumn, and their breaths had shone faintly in the glow of the lantern his father carried. They had come to see the stars, or rather, to let the stars see them, as his father used to say with a quiet smile. That night, the willow had been younger, its leaves more plentiful, and the pond had mirrored every point of light above so clearly that Thomas had thought for a moment there were two skies, one hanging overhead and one lying still at their feet. His father had spread a blanket on the grass, and they had lain side by side, the lantern placed to one side so it would not outshine the heavens. He could remember his father's voice, low and patient, naming the constellations in a way that made them feel like old neighbors. Orion with his belt, the slow arc of the Big Dipper pointing the way to the North Star. But more than the names, it was the quiet that stayed with him, the unbroken spaces between words filled only by the whisper of water and the sigh of the willow in the breeze. Lying there now as a man, Thomas felt the years between then and now narrow, folding inward until the boy he had been seemed to lie just beside him again. He could almost feel the weight of his father's hand resting on his shoulder, steady and warm, as if to say, without words, that the world could be trusted for at least this one night. Above the pond, a shooting star crossed the darkness in a single graceful line. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the moment left behind a quiet thrill, like the lingering touch of a kind word. He watched the place where it had been, knowing the sky would go on offering such moments whether or not anyone was there to see them. Around him, the night sounds had grown clearer, the steady call of crickets, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface, and far off in the trees, the low resonant hoot of an owl beginning its nightly watch. Each sound felt placed with care, as though the night itself had arranged them for the sake of balance. Thomas drew his knees up, resting his arms loosely across them, and let his eyes close for a while. In the darkness behind his lids, the sound of the pond and the feel of the willow at his back became sharper, a living lullaby woven from water, wood, and air. He breathed in the coolness of the night, and with each exhale some small weight seemed to leave him. When he opened his eyes again, the stars had grown brighter, and their reflections in the pond were so clear that it was difficult to tell where the water ended and the sky began. It was the same double sky he remembered from boyhood, the same stillness, and the same sense that he was standing, or sitting, in the center of something vast and unbroken. He thought then about how easily the world could pull a person away from such places. The noise of work, the press of schedules, the endless small demands that filled the hours. But here, beneath the willow, none of that could follow. Here, the only time was the slow turning of the earth, and the only measure was the drift of clouds across the moon. Thomas leaned back once more, his body fitting into the familiar curve of the trunk. The branches above swayed gently, their shadows sliding across his face like passing thoughts. Somewhere in the distance a breeze lifted again, and the pond answered with a faint shiver of ripples. He let his gaze soften until the stars blurred slightly, turning the sky into a single glowing tapestry. And in that gentle blur, he felt himself ease further into the night, not as an observer, but as part of the stillness itself. There was no need to name the constellations now, no need to hold on to any thought at all. It was enough to sit here, to breathe, and to let the quiet do its work. The pond, the willow, and the stars would keep their watch, as they always had, and he could simply be safe in the knowledge that, for this night at least, nothing more was required of him. The night had settled into itself, and everything around the pond seemed to move in a slower, more deliberate rhythm. Even the wind had grown softer, its earlier murmurs through the willow now quieting into the occasional sigh, as if the tree itself were dozing in the cool darkness. Thomas remained beneath the willow, his back resting against the familiar curve of the trunk. From here, the ground sloped gently toward the water, and the moonlight, steady and unbroken now, cast a pale silver sheen over the ripples that lapped against the shore. The air was cooler, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the faint mineral tang of the pond. It was the kind of airs that felt clean in the lungs, as though every breath was washing away something heavy. He noticed how the world seemed to have narrowed to a smaller circle, a circle of moonlit water, the outline of reeds swaying gently, the canopy above, and himself at the center of it all. Outside this circle, the wider world might still be busy in its own way. Cars moving on distant roads, windows lit in far-off houses. But here, time held no urgency. The stars overhead had sharpened in the dark, each one a tiny ember suspended in a sky so deep it seemed without end. He could see their reflections mirrored perfectly on the pond surface, and it was impossible to tell which way was up, whether the stars were above him or below. It felt as if the willow stood between two skies, rooted in the earth yet touching the heavens in both directions. A light splash drew his eyes to a point near the reeds. Something, a fish perhaps, had disturbed the water, sending slow rings outwards until they reached the shore and faded into stillness again. There was a rhythm to these small interruptions, as if the pond needed to remind him now and then that it was alive beneath its calm. Further along the shore, he caught the faint glow of fireflies beginning their quiet work. One blinked close to him, its tiny lamp shining once, twice, before drifting upward and out of sight into the shadows of the willow. The sight pulled another memory from the quiet. Warm nights of childhood when he had chased these lights across the meadow, cupping them gently between his hands only to let them go again and watch them vanish into the dark. He smiled at the thought, remembering how those nights had seemed to last forever, even though the summer always ended too soon. The sounds of the night had shifted as well. The chorus of crickets had grown steady and full, a constant backdrop against which every other sound seemed to find its place. Now and then the soft hoot of an owl carried from somewhere deep in the trees, and once the distant yip of a fox reached him. Brief, a reminder that life was still moving beyond the circle of the pond, but none of these sounds broke the calm. They were part of it, woven into the fabric of the hour like threads in a quilt. Thomas leaned his head back against the trunk and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the sound seemed closer, more intimate. The lap of water at the shore, the gentle shifting of the willow's branches overhead, the steady rhythm of his own breathing. It was a kind of music without beginning or end, meant not to be listened to, but to be absorbed. He thought of how rare it was in his life now to find such complete stillness. Even in moments meant for rest, there is often some small current of thought pulling him onward. A list unfinished, a task waiting for the morning. But here, those currents had grown faint, as if the pond itself had taken them and set them down somewhere beyond reach. Opening his eyes, he saw that the moon had climbed higher, its light casting longer shadows from the reeds and the low branches of the willow. The ground around him was mottled with these shifting shapes, and the pond's surface reflected them in a mirror so perfect that it was hard to tell which was the shadow and which was the thing casting it. The effect was almost hypnotic, and he felt himself drifting in that gentle confusion between light and dark, between what was solid and what was only a reflection. He stretched his legs out in front of him, his boots resting just shy of the water's edge. The soil here was damp, and he could feel its coolness even through the leather. Somewhere nearby, a frog began its low, steady croak, the sound blending with the rest of the night's quiet orchestra. It was comforting in its constancy, as if it would go on for hours, marking time in a way no clock could. In that moment, Thomas felt no urge to move, no thought of the path back to the village or the house where he was staying. There was only this: the pond, the willow, the night spread wide above him, and the knowledge that he was safe inside it. The troubles he had carried here seemed, for now, like distant shapes on the far shore, blurred by mist and unable to cross the water. He let his eyes close again, and this time he did not open them right away. The air was cool on his face, and the scent of the pond wrapped around him like a blanket. His breathing slowed, matching the unhurried rhythm of the night, until the boundary between waking and dreaming began to soften. The willow stood over him, its leaves whispering in the faint breeze, keeping watch in the still hours. and in that watchful silence, Thomas let go of the day entirely, trusting that the night would hold him gently until morning came. Somewhere between sleeping and waking, Thomas became aware of the pond again, not in any sharp or insistent way, but in the quiet recognition of a place that has held you all through the night. The air was still cool on his face, and the scent of damp earth had deepened in the hours since he had closed his eyes. It was a fragrance that seemed to rise from the soil itself, from roots and stones and the dark water that had been resting under the moon's watch. The night was not gone yet. It lingered like a guest reluctant to leave, wrapping the pond in its last folds of shadow. But here and there, faint signs of morning had begun to gather. Far to the east, behind the trees, a line of light pressed gently against the horizon. Not gold yet, but a soft, pale gray, the first suggestion that another day was making its way toward the world. The stars had thinned, their once bright points now softened, as if the sky were drawing a sheer curtain over them. The moon, lower now, cast a more diffuse glow across the water, its path shorter, its reflection gentler. The pond seemed to sense the change, its surface calmer than it had been even an hour before, as if preparing to mirror a new sky. Thomas opened his eyes fully and took in the hush. It was not the same hush as midnight. This was a quieter quiet, tempered by the faint movements of life beginning again. Somewhere in the reeds, a bird gave a single tentative note, testing the air. A moment later, another answered from deeper in the trees. They were not yet singing, just speaking to one another in low, early tones, as though greeting the day before it was ready to be seen. He shifted slightly under the willow, feeling the coolness of the ground through his coat. A thin mist had formed at the edges of the pond, curling in soft trails above the water. It moved so slowly that it was hard to tell whether it drifted on its own or was shaped by a breeze too light to feel. Each wisp of it caught the faint light from the east, turning pale silver before fading back into the dimness. Thomas thought of mornings long ago, when he had followed his father to the barn before sunrise. The grass would be wet underfoot, and the fields wrapped in this same kind of mist, as if the land was waking from a dream, and had not yet decided to open its eyes. There had been a peace in those mornings, a pause before the day's work began, when the only sound was the soft, steady breath of the animals and the occasional creak of a door being opened. Here at the pond, that same pause was present. It was as though the world had stopped just short of beginning, holding itself in balance for one last moment of stillness. The willow's branches hung motionless, their tips almost touching the surface of the water. Not a leaf stirred, and even the ripples from the shore seemed to have gone still. Somewhere far across the pond, the deer returned. Thomas could just make out its shape through the lightning mist, a quiet silhouette stepping to the water's edge. It lowered its head to drink, the sound of its muzzle meeting the water just barely reaching him. Then, after a few moments, it turned back toward the trees, its body dissolving into the pale gray between night and morning. The air had begun to change, less of the deep cool of night, more of the faint freshness that comes before the sun touches the earth. It carried with it the scent of grass, and somewhere in that scent was a note of wildflowers not yet visible in the dim light. He breathed it in slowly, letting it fill the spaces inside him that had been empty when he arrived here. A third bird joined the quiet exchange from the trees, its call slightly stronger than the first two. It was still far from the full chorus of daylight, but it marked the shift. Soon the pond would be brighter, and the paths around it would reveal themselves again in clear detail. For now, though, it was a world in between, a place where night and day held hands for just a little while longer. Thomas pulled his coat a little closer and stayed seated, watching the eastern light grow. He knew the sun would break the horizon soon enough, and with it, the first streaks of gold would spill across the water. But there was no need to hurry toward it. The beauty of morning lay as much in its approach as in its arrival. And so he stayed where he was, held in the quiet at the edge of dawn, letting the day find him slowly in its own unhurried way. The first true light of morning came quietly, as if it had been waiting, standing just beyond the horizon until the pond was ready to receive it. There was no sudden burst, no dramatic unveiling, only the gradual softening of the darkness, the slow turning of gray into the palest blue. Thomas watched as the eastern edge of the sky grew warmer, a faint wash of color blooming there, something between gold and rose, like the inside of a seashell. It spread slowly, and with it came a feeling he had always found difficult to name, a mixture of anticipation and peace, the kind that arrives when you know you are witnessing something both ordinary and rare. The mist over the pond caught that first light and began to change. Where it had been silver in the moonlight, it now held a soft amber glow, each wisp and curl lit from within. It drifted above the water like a breath that the morning had just released. The reflections on the pond shifted too. The stars had faded entirely now, and in their place the mirrored sky began to brighten with the colors of day. A gentle ripple moved across the surface, though Thomas could see no fish or bird to account for it. It was as if the water itself had stirred in greeting, acknowledging the arrival of the sun's light. Along the far bank, the reeds swayed slightly, their tips crowned in gold. Even the willow seemed to change its posture, its leaves now catching the faint warmth and turning it into a slow shimmer. The birds who had been speaking in tentative calls earlier were beginning to find their voices. One by one, they joined the morning's chorus. A thrush somewhere deep in the woods, a wren in the thicket, and the clear, sweet call of a robin, close enough that Thomas could almost see it. Their notes overlapped gently, never crowding one another, as if each knew its place in the music. From his seat beneath the willow, Thomas felt the air shift again. The coolness of night was still present, but it carried a thread of warmth now, subtle yet unmistakable. He loosened his coat slightly, welcoming the change. It was the first reminder that the day ahead would be lived in light. In the growing brightness, details began to return to the world around him. The lines of the opposite shore sharpened. He could make out the moss-covered stones at the water's edge, the soft curve of the path winding into the meadow. The surface of the pond showed its true colors now, not simply blue or gray, but a shifting mosaic of pale gold, deep green from the reflected trees, and the soft white of passing clouds. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, and simply watched the transformation unfold. There was no hurry to it. The sun moved at its own pace, and the pond received it without resistance. Thomas thought about how many mornings like this the willow had witnessed, how many times its leaves had woken to the same light, year after year. It had never seemed to tire of the ritual. Across the pond, movement caught his eye. A pair of ducks gliding into view from behind the reeds. Their feathers were rich in the morning light, the green on the drake's head shining like polished glass. They moved without hurry, leaving a delicate wake that bent and curved across the water's surface. Every few moments, one would dip its head, sending small rings outward until they met the reflection of the sky. The warmth of the light grew stronger, stretching across the pond until it reached the willow's base. It touched the bark beside him first, a small patch of brightness spreading upward through the branches. When it reached his hands, he felt its gentleness, not yet the full heat of midday, but enough to make his skin aware of the day's arrival. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sunlight rest on his face. Behind his lids, the glow was richer, turning the darkness there into a soft, living gold. In that stillness, he could hear the pond's subtle conversations, the rustle of reeds, the distant call of a morning dove, the faint lapping of water at the shore. When he opened his eyes again, the sun had cleared the tree line, and the pond was awash in light. Shadows were shorter now, their edges sharper. The mist had thinned to almost nothing, its last traces rising like a memory into the warming air. Somewhere beyond the meadow, a rooster crowed, its call carrying just far enough to reach him where he sat. Thomas drew in a long, slow breath, filling his lungs with the scent of the new day. It was the smell of wet grass, of warmed wood, and of the faint sweetness from blossoms just beginning to open. It felt like a promise, quiet, unspoken, but present all the same. He stayed under the willow a little longer, watching the sunlight deepen on the water, before the thought of standing crossed his mind. There was no reason to rush. The day would be here for hours yet, but he knew that when he finally rose, he would carry this light with him, folded somewhere deep inside, ready to be remembered when the world beyond the pond asked more of him than it should. The sun was now fully present, its light lying warm and steady across the pond. The water reflected it in broken patterns, a shifting quilt of gold and soft green, stitched together by the movement of the breeze. The willow behind Thomas cast a long, cool shadow that reached toward the far bank, its leaves catching the light at their tips, glimmering each time they swayed. Thomas rose slowly, feeling the easy weight of the morning in his limbs. There was no stiffness, only a sense of having rested in the company of something that had watched over him without interruption. He dusted off the back of his trousers, then turned toward the narrow path that curved along the shore. The grass beneath his boots was still damp with dew, and each step left a faint dark imprint that quickly softened back into green. The air had warmed just enough to carry the scent of the meadow, sweet, earthy, and touched with the sharp freshness of crushed leaves. Somewhere ahead, he could hear the faint chatter of birds in the hedgerow, their voices brighter now than they had been in the gray hour before dawn. At the first bend, the pond opened up in front of him again, seen now from a new angle. The far bank, which had been only a shadowed outline at night, was now detailed and clear. Low stones lined the edge in places, their surfaces slick with moss. Between the stones grew patches of wild mint, and when the wind shifted, its scent threaded into the air like a quiet offering. Thomas slowed near a cluster of reeds where dragonflies hovered, their wings catching the sun and scattering it into shards of color. Some darted away when he stepped closer, but others remained, balanced on the reed tips with the stillness that mirrored the pond itself. He remembered being a boy here, trying to catch one with cupped hands, only to find that the slightest shadow of movement sent them flashing away, too quick for clumsy fingers. Now, he had no desire to disturb them. Their presence was gift enough, Further along, a small cove tucked itself into the shoreline, its water calmer than the rest of the pond. Here, lilies floated with their faces open to the sun, white and yellow blooms resting on round green pads. A frog sat on one of the pads near the center, its skin dark and glistening. It regarded him for a moment with steady eyes, then slipped soundlessly into the water, sending out a brief ripple that vanished almost as soon as it began. The path turned gently toward the meadow. On this side of the pond, the land opened wide, and the morning light poured across it without obstruction. The grass bent and swayed, tipped with seeds that shimmered in the breeze. A few swallows dipped low over the water, their wings brushing close to the surface before they rose again, looping back in effortless arcs. Thomas paused where the path came closest to the pond's edge. He crouched there for a moment, resting his hand in the cool water. It was clear enough that he could see small fish moving in the shallows, their bodies quick and bright in the sun. He stayed like that for a while, letting the water run over his fingers, its chill a pleasant contrast to the growing warmth of the day. Rising again, he followed the curve of the path until it brought him back toward the shelter of the trees. Here, the light was filtered, broken into dappled patterns that shifted across the ground as the leaves moved. The air was different too, cooler, scented with the faint musk of fallen leaves beginning to soften into the soil. Somewhere above, a woodpecker worked at a tree, its steady tapping echoing in the quiet like a heartbeat. The willow came into sight again, its long branches trailing over the water in a way that made them seem part of the pond itself. He slowed his steps, not because he was tired, but because he felt no need to arrive too quickly. The walk had been less about going somewhere than about noticing. The slow catalog of light and scent, sound and movement that the morning had offered him piece by piece. When he reached the place where he had started, he paused once more beneath the willow's shade. The pond was now fully awake, birds moving in and out of the reeds, insects weaving their invisible paths above the water, the surface shifting with the breeze. And yet, despite all this movement, the calm remained. It lay not in the absence of life, but in the way each thing here belonged to its moment, unrushed and unmeasured. Thomas rested a hand against the trunk of the willow, feeling the texture of its bark under his palm. He knew he would walk this path again, perhaps later today, perhaps years from now, and it would still be here, changed only in the slow, graceful ways that time allowed. For now, the pond and the tree and the morning itself were enough, and he let that be the final thought before turning toward the rest of the day. Leaving the willow's shade, Thomas stepped toward the narrow opening in the trees where the path met the meadow. The sunlight there was different, no longer filtered through branches, but spread wide and unbroken, pouring over the tall grass like a slow tide of warmth. He paused for a moment at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness, feeling the day open in front of him. The meadow stretched out in gentle undulations, its far edge meeting the low rise of distant hills. The grass was knee-high in most places, a mixture of soft green and golden stalks, tipped with seeds that caught the light and swayed in the morning breeze. Among them were patches of wildflowers, pale blue chicory, small clusters of white yarrow, and the deep yellow faces of black-eyed Susans turning toward the sun. As he walked into the meadow, the air felt warmer, carrying the sweet, slightly dry scent of grass in late summer. Bees moved from flower to flower, their low hum steady and unhurried. A monarch butterfly drifted across his path, its wings opening and closing like the slow turning of pages. It lingered near a stand of milkweed before rising again, its flight so gentle that it seemed to float on the breath of the day. The ground underfoot was uneven in places, soft where the soil held more moisture, firm where the sun had baked it dry. Each step released a faint fragrance from the crushed grass, a smell that pulled him backward in time, to barefoot days as a boy, running through fields without thought of where he was headed, only the joy of movement and the wide open sky above. A faint path wound through the meadow, not marked by anything deliberate, but simply by use. The regular passage of deer, or perhaps the quiet steps of someone else who liked to walk here. It led him past a cluster of wild blackberries, the canes arching over with the weight of their fruit. Some berries were still red and hard, but others had ripened to a deep, dusty purple. He picked one, rolling it between his fingers before placing it in his mouth. The sweetness came first, then the faint tartness that lingered at the edges. A taste as much a part of the summer as the warmth on his shoulders. A meadowlark called from somewhere ahead, its bright fluting song carrying clearly in the open air. He stopped to listen, spotting the small brown and yellow bird perched on a fence post near the far edge of the field. It sang again, its head tilted slightly upward, and for a moment Thomas felt as though the entire meadow was listening too. The breeze moved through the grass in waves, bending it first in one direction, then another. From where he stood, it was like watching the surface of a green sea, the swells rolling away toward the hills. Each gust brought with it the rustle of stalks brushing against one another, a soft, endless sound that seemed to carry its own rhythm. In the middle of the meadow, he found a fallen log, weathered gray and half hidden in the grass. It might have been here for years, slowly returning to the soil. He sat on it for a while, feeling the warmth it had gathered from the sun. From here, the pond was just visible through a gap in the trees, its surface now fully awake under the morning light. The willow was a dark green shape at its edge, still and watchful even from this distance. He thought about how places like this, the meadow, the pond, the quiet paths between them, were part of a single whole. They didn't compete for attention, each had its own hour, its own way of holding the light and air. The pond offered reflection and stillness, while the meadow opened itself wide to movement and sky. Both were needed. A grasshopper landed on the log beside him, its body angled to catch the sun. For a moment it remained perfectly still, then leapt away into the grass with a sound like the click of a tiny hinge. Thomas followed its arc with his eyes until it vanished, then let his gaze wander back over the field. The air carried a faint change now, still warm, but with a thread of dryness that hinted at the day's heat to come. He knew the meadow would grow quieter then, the bees retreating to shade, the flowers folding slightly against the sun. But for now, everything was open and alive, and he was content to be one more quiet figure moving through it. When he finally rose, he took the path that curved gently back toward the trees. The light shifted again as he stepped under the first branches, the heat of the meadow giving way to the cool, dappled shade of the woods. Somewhere ahead, the sound of the pond's water reached him, a soft, familiar greeting that made him feel as though he had been away longer than he had. He walked toward it, noticing how the sunlight spilled in broken shapes across the forest floor, how the air here smelled of moss and old leaves. It was a slower world under the canopy, and he found himself slowing to match it. By the time the willow came into view again, it felt as though the morning had deepened into something more than hours. It had become a space, a quiet country in which he had been allowed to wander freely, in which he would carry with him long after he stepped beyond its borders. By the time Thomas reached the willow again, the light had shifted into the fullness of midday. The shadows were shorter now, the air thicker with warmth. The pond lay before him like a sheet of softened glass, its surface only occasionally broken by the quiet circle of a fish rising or the fall of a willow leaf. It was the hour when the countryside seemed to hold its breath, neither rushing forward nor pulling back, just resting in the stillness that came after the morning's busy stir. He lowered himself onto the patch of grass at the base of the willow, choosing a place where the roots curved above the soil like old knuckles. The trunk's bark was warm under his hand, its ridges holding the faint scent of sunlit wood. Above, the willow's branches moved just enough to make a sound like distant rain, though the sky above was a perfect, unbroken blue. From here, Thomas could see the full sweep of the pond. On the far side, the meadow he had just walked through glowed with a gold-tinged green, its motion slower now in the gentler breeze. Closer to him, the reeds stood tall and patient, their narrow leaves catching small flashes of light when they shifted. A dragonfly skimmed low over the water, its shadow chasing just beneath it, and then it was gone, vanishing into the brightness like a thought half remembered. The warmth of the day pressed gently around him. It was not the heavy heat of high summer that demanded retreat, but a steady, enveloping warmth that invited stillness. Somewhere in the branches above, a cicada began its steady rising call, the sound weaving itself into the hush of the hour. He listened without trying to count the seconds, letting the sound come and go as it pleased. Every so often, a ripple spread across the pond, a widening circle that took its time before fading back into the stillness. He tried to follow the origin, a fish perhaps, or a turtle shifting under the surface, but the water gave no further clue. It was one of those small mysteries the pond seemed to keep for itself, and Thomas was content to let it remain unanswered. He leaned back against the trunk, his hat tilted forward just enough to shade his eyes. From this angle, the willow's branches framed the sky in long, slender lines, their tips dipping toward the water. A few leaves had already begun to yellow at the edges, hinting at the turn of season still weeks away. The thought brought no sadness, only the quiet awareness that everything here was moving forward in its own time. Somewhere down the shore, a heron lifted from the reeds, its wings slow and deliberate. It crossed the pond without hurry, its reflection gliding just beneath it, and landed on the opposite bank where it stood motionless, as though deciding what to do next. Thomas watched until it became part of the scenery, another patient figure in the midday quiet. The air smelled faintly of sun-warmed grass and the clean edge of water. Now and then a breath of cooler air drifted through the willow's branches, bringing with it the earthy scent of the shaded ground. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the layered quiet, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant hum of insects, the almost imperceptible lap of water at the shore. Time felt less like a line here and more like a pool, something wide and still where moments could settle without urgency. He thought about how rarely he allowed himself this kind of pause. Most days seemed to demand movement, as though worth could only be proven by what was done. But here, beneath the willow, He could feel the truth that sometimes the most necessary thing was to be still, to let the world move around you without chasing it. He shifted slightly, stretching his legs toward the water's edge. A pair of ducks emerged from the reeds, gliding side by side with the kind of unspoken ease that comes from long familiarity. They moved toward the center of the pond, their bodies leaving narrow wakes that spread outward until they dissolved. When they reached the far side, they disappeared again among the reeds, as though the small journey had been enough for now. Thomas imagined the pond in other hours, how the light would turn softer toward evening, how the first coolness of night would settle into the grass, but he stayed with the present, letting the midday hold him. The sun had a way of making the water's surface shimmer faintly, as if there were something just beneath it, a second pond hidden inside the first. It reminded him of summer days as a boy, lying on his back beside a creek and watching sunlight break into shifting patterns across the current. The willow's shadow shifted almost imperceptibly, creeping a little farther across the grass as the sun inched westward. It was a sign that the hour was passing, though here, its passing felt less like loss and more like the slow turning of a page. He thought of staying until the shadow stretched long again, until the coolness began to return, and decided there was no reason not to. For now, he was simply another quiet presence beside the pond, rooted like the willow, still and attentive. The day moved forward at its own pace, and Thomas, in rare agreement with it, moved no faster than the shade beneath the branches. By the time Thomas opened his eyes again, the feel of the day had shifted. It wasn't a sudden thing, but more like the subtle change in a familiar melody. The notes still the same, yet carried on a gentler breath. The sun had begun its slow lean toward the west, and with it came a light less direct, more forgiving, as though the world had decided to lower its voice. The pond, which at midday had been bright and almost too clear, now held a softer reflection. Shadows reached farther from the trees, stretching their shapes across the grass and into the water. The reeds wore a deeper green in this new light, and the far meadow glowed in a muted gold, the kind that made distance feel closer than it really was. The willow's branches stirred with a little more ease, as if the weight of the afternoon heat had lifted from them. Every so often, a breeze would slip between the leaves, carrying with it the scent of cooling earth and a faint trace of clover from the meadow. Thomas breathed it in slowly, the way one might hold onto a word that carried meaning beyond its sound. Somewhere nearby, a grasshopper clicked its wings in short bursts, and a pair of swallows traced looping patterns above the water. Their movements were quick but never frantic, each dive and turn shaped by a purpose older than memory. He followed them until they disappeared toward the far bank, where the shadows had grown deep enough to suggest evening was near. Thomas let his gaze rest on the pond's surface again. The water now mirrored not only the sky but also the mood of the hour. Unhurried, slightly drowsy, as if it too felt the pull toward stillness. The ripples that had been sharp under midday light were now softer, edges blurred by the changing angle of the sun. It was a kind of beauty he'd learned to recognize only after years of watching, that moment when brightness surrenders its place to quiet color, when the day stops trying to shine and simply rests in itself. A lone dragonfly hovered in front of him, its wings catching the last strong rays in flashes of copper and green. It stayed suspended for a heartbeat longer, then veered toward the reeds with a motion so smooth it barely disturbed the air. He wondered if the dragonfly knew the day was winding down, or if it simply followed the shape of its instincts, unconcerned with clocks and calendars. Leaning back against the willow's trunk, Thomas thought of other late afternoons he had known here. Some had been shared, with a friend sitting beside him, or the laughter of children skimming stones into the water. Others had been solitary, marked only by the sound of the wind and the hum of insects. This one, he decided, belonged to the quieter kind. A faint creak reached his ears, and he turned to see a small rowboat drifting lazily near the opposite bank. It was empty, likely loosened from its mooring by the shifting water. The current carried it just far enough for the breeze to catch, turning it slightly so its bow faced the open pond. It looked content to go nowhere in particular, a companion to his own unhurried afternoon. The willow's shade had lengthened until it touched the edge of the pond, a dark ribbon laid gently across the bright grass. Thomas moved slightly to stay within it, noticing how the temperature shifted with even a few steps. The air here held a coolness that hinted at night's approach, though the day still had hours left to give. He watched as the swallows returned, this time flying lower, their reflections briefly touching the water before lifting away. One skimmed so close that its wingtips left 2 parallel lines behind it, a signature that vanished as quickly as it had been made. He smiled at the thought that nothing here seemed in a hurry to last, and yet, in its passing, each moment carried a weight that stayed with him. Somewhere behind him, the faint sound of a cowbell drifted through the air, likely from the pasture beyond the trees. It was a steady, rhythmic tone, made softer by distance, and it seemed to settle into the quiet, like an old friend arriving without announcement. He realized then that the pond had its own way of marking time. It didn't do so with numbers or measures, but with the angle of shadows, the shift in the color of light, and the small changes in what could be heard and smelled and felt. It was a clock without hands, and in its company, he found himself caring less about the hours he had once thought important. The first hints of evening coolness brushed his skin, and Thomas knew the day was moving toward its close. But there was no sense of loss, only the knowledge that this was the natural order of things. He would watch the light soften further, see the first touch of pink in the clouds above the hills, and remain here until the willow's shade in the dusk became one. For now, he stayed where he was, his back against the tree, his eyes on the pond, and the soft murmur of leaves filling the spaces between his breaths. It was enough, more than enough, to be present in this hour, to let the day turn as it always had, and to meet it without asking it to be anything other than what it was. The sun had begun its steady, unhurried descent, and the light spilling over Miller's pond shifted again, now wrapped in tones of deep amber and warm honey. The pond seemed to drink it in, its surface carrying the glow as if holding a secret warmth just beneath the waterline. It was the hour when edges softened, the line where a meadow met pond grew hazy, and the willow's branches cast long shadows that reached farther than Thomas remembered them stretching before. He stayed under the tree's shelter, his back still against the ridge trunk, watching the way light moved differently now, not upward, not searching, but gently folding itself back toward the earth. There was a comfort in that gesture, as though the day itself was settling into rest. The swallows that had darted and looped earlier in the afternoon were now fewer, their circles wider, their calls less frequent. A single one passed low over the pond, its body a swift shadow against the water's molten gold, and then it was gone toward the darker line of trees beyond the meadow. Thomas listened for the sound of its wings, but the evening air seemed to absorb it before it reached him. Somewhere across the meadow, the low murmur of cattle drifted toward the pond. It was a sound that carried both distance and familiarity, a reminder that the world beyond this willow still turned in its own quiet labors. The cows would soon be gathered, their slow return to the barn matching the pace of the sun's descent. Even the air felt deliberate, each breeze cooler than the last, carrying with it the faint tang of tilled soil and the grassy scent of the pasture. The sky itself had begun to change. High above the pond, the blue was deepening, its brightness yielding to something richer. To the west, streaks of pale orange brushed the horizon, fading into the faintest blush of pink. He had seen sunsets here before, each one different in its arrangement, but always marked by the same patience. No rush of color, no dramatic flare, just a steady deepening of tone, as if the sky were lowering its own voice in respect for the closing day. Thomas let his gaze wander to the water again. A pair of ducks had returned from the reeds, drifting in close companionship toward the willow's shaded edge. They moved without hurry, their wake trailing behind them in soft, widening curves. He imagined the world must look different from their vantage point. The pond stretching wide and endless, the willow's hanging branches a curtain that brushed the very edge of their world. A leaf, loosened from its branch, spiraled slowly down before landing on the water. It floated there, carried just enough by a small current to move past the shadowed shore. Thomas followed its journey until it was too far to see, thinking how so much of life was like that. A quiet drifting into the larger expanse without need for resistance. The crickets had begun their evening chorus, soft at first as though testing the air, then growing in confidence as the light dimmed. Their steady rhythm filled the spaces between other sounds. The occasional plop of a fish, the whisper of grass against grass in the meadow, the faint sigh of wind through the willow's upper branches. He felt the way these sounds worked together, not competing, but layering into something whole. From his place beneath the willow, he noticed how the pond now reflected not just the sky but the mood of the hour. The golden glow on its surface was deepening into amber, while in the shallower edges the water darkened to a green that held the shadow of the reeds. Each shift in light seemed to ask for a slower breath, and he obliged, drawing the air deep into his lungs, letting it out just as slowly. The thought came to him, as it often did in moments like this, that the pond did not belong to any one season or hour. It had been here long before his visits, and would remain long after. And yet, in some quiet way, the pond seemed to know him, to have kept his company through afternoons like this, through years when the world beyond its banks had been louder and less forgiving. It held the shape of those visits, as if each hour he had spent here had left a trace in its stillness. The light reached a point where it was no longer above him, but all around, glowing from the water, from the grass, even from the air itself. The willow's shadow, once a cool refuge from the sun, now blended with the rest of the evening shade, losing its edge as night approached. Thomas thought of staying until the first star appeared, a small, steady light above the still surface of the pond. It was a promise he had made to himself on other evenings, and one he intended to keep again tonight. The coolness grew, not sudden but steady, like the slow turning of a page. He pulled his jacket closer, though he welcomed the shift. It reminded him that the day was offering its last gifts before surrendering tonight. The softened colors, the quiet air, the way every sound seemed to settle just a little deeper into the landscape. A heron returned to the far bank, its wings wide in the fading light. It landed with the same patience it had flown, folding itself into stillness as if it too understood the value of waiting. Thomas watched until the heron became part of the shadowed shore, its shape almost indistinguishable from the reeds, and then, without deciding to, he closed his eyes again. Not to sleep, but to let the evening seep in without distraction. The warmth of the day was gone, but in its place was something just as valuable, a sense of being held by the quiet, by the pond, by the slow and certain turning of the world toward rest. He opened them only when the breeze shifted once more, bringing with it the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the meadow. It was the final sign that the day was moving into night, and that he was exactly where he needed to be to watch it happen. The last light had drawn itself low along the horizon, a thin band of gold melting into blue, until even that blue began to surrender to the quiet darkness above. Thomas remained where he was, his back steady against the familiar trunk of the willow, feeling the ground's slow release of the day's warmth through the fabric of his jacket. It was the hour when the air became more than just cool, when it carried a slight weight to it, the way night always does, as though the world itself were drawing closer, tucking in its edges. The meadow beyond the pond had lost its color, the grasses now a soft gray in the dimming light, but the outlines of each stem still swayed, still caught the touch of the breeze. Above him, the willow's long, trailing branches were no longer green or gold, but shapes, fine moving lines against the deepening sky. He watched one branch shift in the gentlest of winds, its motion so slow it seemed almost to hesitate, and he thought of how many nights these branches had lived through, how many seasons they had bent under rain or held snow in the hush of winter. They had been here, standing watch over the pond, long before his first visit. The first star came quietly, without announcement, appearing in the east where the sky was clearest. It was not the brightest yet, but it was steady, a pinprick of light that somehow felt near despite its distance. Thomas let his gaze rest on it for a while, feeling the way his breathing matched the stillness of that small light. He had learned over the years that stars are never in a hurry, and perhaps that was why they were so reassuring. Another followed, slightly higher in the sky, and then a third near the far edge of the meadow. Each arrival seemed to slow time further, as though night itself was laying its stars down one by one, careful not to disturb the earth below. The reflection of the first star trembled in the pond, a tiny spark caught among the dark ripples. It was strange to think that what he was seeing above had traveled so far to rest in this small corner of water. From somewhere beyond the tree line came the low, rounded call of an owl. The sound rolled across the meadow and lingered in the air, its tone calm, almost conversational, as if announcing that the day had, at last, given way. Thomas had always liked the sound of owls. It carried the depth of night without any sharpness, a voice that felt at home in the dark. In the reeds near the far bank, a faint rustle told him that the ducks had settled in for the night. The soft splash of water followed, then quiet again. The pond's surface was darker now, the mirror of the sky above, except where a few ripples caught the faint starlight. He shifted slightly, stretching his legs out on the cool ground, and let his hand rest in the grass beside him. It was damp with evening dew, each blade smooth and cool against his skin. The scent of it rose faintly, mingling with the woody hint of the willow's bark and the faint, faraway trace of wood smoke still drifting from some unseen chimney. The world at this hour felt both vast and enclosed. The stars above stretched into distances he could not measure, but the pond, the willow, and the meadow wrapped him in something smaller, something that asked nothing more of him than to be still. It was a balance he had always sought without fully naming it, to feel both the wide openness of the night and the close, quiet shelter of the familiar. As the sky grew richer with points of light, he found himself recalling other evenings here, nights when he had sat in this very spot with friends or family, their voices low, their laughter softened by the air. Some of those people were far away now, some gone entirely, but the pond seemed to hold their presence all the same, as if the night could remember. The breeze slowed, and the air settled into that particular stillness that comes just before full night. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory of those past voices mix with the present sound of the crickets and the quiet lapping of water. When he opened them again, the stars had multiplied, their faint light weaving a delicate net over the dark. He did not think of leaving yet. The night had more to offer, not in events but in its unhurried way of unfolding. It was a gift, he thought, to have the time and the place to simply be present for it. The willow's shadow lay long and deep across the bank, its lines softer now, almost indistinguishable from the night around it. But Thomas could still feel its presence above him, a kind of quiet guardian, rooted and steady, its branches speaking in whispers only the wind could understand. Somewhere overhead, a bat flickered briefly against the stars, its movement so quick it might have been imagined, and then, just as quickly, it was gone into the darkness, leaving the sky unchanged. The pond reflected it all, the stillness, the starlight, the soft curve of the meadow beyond. And Thomas, in his place beneath the willow, felt the slow rhythm of the night take hold, easing the edges of thought, carrying him further into the gentle quiet. The night had deepened to a velvet blue, a shade so complete it seemed to soften the edges of everything. The far hills had disappeared into the dark, and the pond was now only a darker shape in the field, its surface holding the faint scatter of stars like small lanterns set adrift. Thomas leaned his head back against the willow's trunk. The bark was firm but not unkind, its ridges and grooves a map he knew without needing to see. He could feel the slow pulse of the earth through it, as if the tree itself was breathing. Not quickly, not urgently, but in long, patient intervals that asked nothing of him but to match its pace. A quiet hum rose from the grasses, the steady chorus of crickets taking up the work of the evening. Their sound was not a single note, but a weaving of many, threaded together in a pattern older than he could name. Somewhere farther away, the faint trill of a night bird slipped into the mix, then faded, leaving the steady rhythm of the crickets behind. The air had cooled further, and with it came the scent of the pond, a mixture of damp earth, the faint sweetness of water plants, and that mineral note that always seems to rise after sundown. It mingled with the dry, woody smell of the willow, creating a quiet perfume that belonged to this place alone. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the sounds and scents fold over him. Behind his eyelids, the starlight still seemed to shimmer faintly, as if some part of him could see it without looking. He thought of the many nights he had sat here in years past, sometimes alone, sometimes with a companion whose voice he could still remember in fragments. A laugh carried away by wind, a word spoken low so as not to disturb the quiet. The memory didn't ache, It felt instead like finding an old letter in a drawer, one you hadn't meant to keep but somehow had. A gentle reminder that you have lived many evenings and each one has left some part of itself behind. A breeze stirred, lifting the willow's branches just enough for them to brush together with the lightest sound. Not quite a rustle, more like the soft sweep of a hand over fabric. It was the sort of sound you could almost miss if you weren't listening, but Thomas was listening. The night had its own language, and this was one of its softer syllables. Somewhere beyond the pond, in the shadowed line of the meadow's edge, a firefly blinked once, twice, then went dark again. It seemed too late in the season for them, but here it was, carrying its small light as if on some last errand. Thomas smiled at the thought, feeling a kinship with that small persistence. The stillness around him began to feel heavier, not in a way that pressed, but in a way that invited rest. His shoulders loosened, the weight of the day slipped further away. Even his thoughts seemed to slow, their edges blurring into the night air. There was no urgency here, no decision to make, no voice to answer, just the steady, living quiet of the meadow and pond. He let himself drift in that space between wakefulness and sleep, where the senses linger but begin to untether. The coolness of the air at his cheek, the smell of damp earth rising from the grass, the faint reflection of a star trembling in the pond. These details seemed to move in and out of focus, as if the night itself were turning the pages for him. Far off, the owl called again, its voice low and rounded, unhurried in its passage through the dark. Thomas felt the sound travel across the water, over the grass, and into the shelter of the willow's shadow. It was a voice that had been here long before him, and would remain long after, steady as the stars above. He breathed in slowly, and when he let the air go, it seemed to take the last fragments of wakefulness with it, not into sleep yet, but into that deeper stillness where sleep is already waiting. Somewhere in the shifting border between thought and dream, he imagined the willow's branches leaning a little closer, their green now silver in the starlight, their tips brushing the surface of the pond like fingertips. He thought he could hear them speaking, not in words, but in a long, low murmur that belonged only to the tree in the night. The sound followed him as his breathing slowed again, the night folding itself gently around him, the pond, the meadow, the stars. Each seemed to take a place in that quiet circle, holding him there without a touch, and in that holding, Thomas felt a truth as simple as it was complete, that he was safe, that the night could be trusted, and that rest would come as surely as the stars had. Somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, the edges of the night began to blur. The stars no longer seemed fixed in their places, but shifted ever so slightly, as if the pond's surface had become a vast mirror and someone had gently moved their hand across it. Thomas felt no startle in this, only a deep, quiet acceptance, as though this was how the world always was when you truly looked, soft, mutable, like a watercolor that had been left in the rain. The willow's branches hung lower now, their tips tracing invisible shapes in the air. He thought he could hear them speaking to one another, small, secret sounds, like the murmuring of people in the next room, not meant to be understood, only felt. His breath had slowed to match the rhythm of the night, and with each inhale, the world seemed to grow softer around him. The pond's scent, damp, earthen, faintly sweet, drifted closer, carried by a breeze so mild it felt like the brush of a sleeve in passing. In the quiet, memory began to move toward him, not with force, but with the easy persistence of water finding its way downhill. He saw himself as a boy, barefoot in summer grass, the heat of the day still clinging to his skin. The same willow stood by the pond then, its trunk slimmer, its leaves a brighter green, its roots not yet as deep. He remembered how he had tried to climb it once, managing only to reach the first low branch. From there he had dangled, half proud, half unsure, watching the water below. A dragonfly had rested on the surface for the briefest moment, its wings catching the sun in shards of blue and gold before it lifted away again. He had thought even then that the pond was a kind of world all its own, one that didn't rush, didn't answer to the clocks inside the farmhouse. The memory faded as gently as it had come, and he was back under the night sky, but now the boy he had been seemed to linger just beside him, quietly sharing the same breath. Somewhere across the water, a ripple formed, spreading in perfect circles until it reached the far reeds. Perhaps a fish had stirred, or perhaps it was only the pond reminding itself that it was alive. Thomas listened to the faint lap of water against the shore, a sound so even, so measured, it might have been a clock in a slower world. His mind wandered again, not toward sharp thoughts, but toward the kind that feel like shadows moving over a field. He imagined the farmhouse at this hour, its windows dim, the last ember in the stove fading to ash. Somewhere in the loft, a barn cat curled into itself, tucking nose to tail against the cool. The smell of hay would be rich there, even in darkness. Another breeze passed and he felt the temperature dip just slightly. It wasn't a chill, only the night settling further in, the way a blanket might fall closer around your shoulders. Above, the willow's leaves whispered again, and this time he thought they were answering some question he hadn't asked. In that half-dreaming state, time no longer seemed to move forward. It folded instead, like the pond holding both stars and their reflection at once, or the willow standing in both the present and every season it had ever known. Thomas felt himself drift, not away from the night, but deeper into it. Each sound, the crickets, the faint plink of water, the distant owl, became a thread, and together they wove something wide and warm enough to lie down in. His body was still beneath the willow, but some quieter part of him began to walk a path he couldn't see. The air along it was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke. Somewhere ahead, he thought he could hear the gentle clink of a teacup being set down and the sound of a chair shifting on a wooden floor. It wasn't far, it wasn't urgent, it was simply there, waiting for him to arrive when he was ready. The pond, the meadow, the willow, they would remain behind him, but not lost. They would follow, carried in the quiet of his own breathing. He'd let that thought settle in, like the last leaf drifting to the ground, and felt the world grow softer still. The path seemed to unfold without hurry, its edges softened by years of moss and fallen leaves. Thomas walked as though his feet already knew the way, each step a gentle conversation with the earth beneath him. The air was cool now, but it carried the warmth of familiar scents, a blend of wood smoke, damp cedar, and something faintly sweet, like the memory of apples kept too long in a cellar. Above, the branches arched overhead, their limbs holding the night like a cupped hand. Gaps in the leaves revealed small pockets of stars, glimmering faintly as though they too were growing sleepy. It was the kind of sky that made you think of promises, not the loud ones, but the kind that were never spoken aloud, only kept quietly over the course of years. To his left he glimpsed the faint shimmer of water between the trees. The pond was still nearby, its surface now dark as ink. The willow, though out of sight, felt close in spirit, as if its presence extended through the ground, reaching him here. The path narrowed slightly, and he placed his hands lightly on the trunks as he passed, the roughness of bark grounding him in the moment. Some were maple, some oak, and one, tall and slightly leaning, was a beech, its smooth surface pale even in the dim light. He thought of carving initials there, the way boys once did, but found itself only resting his palm against it instead, leaving no mark but the warmth of his hand. Up ahead, the light changed. It was not brighter exactly, but softer, as though the darkness had been thinned by the presence of a home. And then he saw it, a small cabin set just at the bend in the path, its windows glowing with a muted amber. The glow spilled onto the porch in gentle pools, catching the outlines of an old rocking chair and the curve of a clay jug left by the steps. He slowed without meaning to. It was the kind of place you approached as if it might disappear if you came too quickly. The boards of the porch creaked faintly under his weight, not in protest, but as though acknowledging his arrival. Through the window, he could see the faint shape of a table, a single candle in its center, its flame swaying ever so slightly. Thomas opened the door without knocking. It did not feel like trespass. It felt like coming in from the cold. The air inside was warm in a way that went beyond temperature. It carried the scent of chamomile and old books, with the faintest trace of flour, as though bread had been baked there not long ago. A chair sat by the hearth, its cushions a little flattened from years of use. Beside it, a small side table held a teacup, steam curling lazily from its surface. He did not ask who had prepared it. He only knew it was for him. He wrapped his hands around the cup, feeling the heat sink into his palms. The first sip was as gentle as the room itself, not a rush of flavor, but a slow unfolding. He let his eyes wander over the shelves on the far wall. They were lined with jars of herbs, each labeled in neat handwriting. Dried lavender hung in small bundles near the window, their purple muted but still carrying a whisper of summer fields. In the corner, a woven basket held folded quilts, their edges worn smooth from use. The chair by the fire seemed to call him, and he answered by settling into it. The cushion gave way under his weight, cradling him in a way that made his shoulders drop. The fire was small, just a few logs burning steadily, but it filled the room with a light that flickered across the walls, casting slow-moving shadows like old friends pacing in thought. Time loosened its grip here. He could not have said whether minutes or hours passed. The only sound was the occasional pop from the logs, and somewhere outside, the faint hoot of an owl. He felt his body sinking further into rest, the tea still warm in his hands, the heat of the fire moving through him in waves. Through the haze of quiet, he remembered the walk from the willow. It seemed both recent and far away, as though the path itself had been part of some gentle dream. The pond, the branches, the slow-moving air, they were still with him, woven into the walls of this little cabin, and as his eyes grew heavier, he had the sense, deep and certain, that when he woke, the willow would still be there, the pond still waiting, the path still leading him home. Morning in the cabin did not announce itself with haste. It slipped in like a guest who knew the household well, unfolding gently across the floorboards, laying soft patches of gold over the worn rug and the smooth arm of the rocking chair. Thomas woke not to an alarm, but to the whisper of wind along the eaves, It sounded almost like someone running their fingers over an old fiddle string, low, steady, without urgency. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but the room held its warmth, as though the night had decided to linger a little longer just for him. He sat for a while before rising, not in laziness, but in quiet respect for the way a day should begin. From the window beside the chair, he could see the pond through a thin veil of mist. The willow was only a shadow at first, its shape softened and blurred, but as he watched, the light found it, turning its branches into lines of silver that swayed with a rhythm only it knew. The teacup from last night still sat on the table beside him, a faint ring of dried chamomile marking the place where the liquid had cooled. He carried it to the basin, rinsing it with water drawn from a jug near the door. The sound of water meeting porcelain was small, but in that space it felt like a kind of music. Outside, the grass was wet beneath his boots, not the soaking damp of a heavy rain, but the fresh, bright moisture that comes with a clear morning. The air was cool enough to wake his skin, but held the promise of warmth as the sun climbed higher. He followed the path he had taken the night before, though now it seemed almost a different place. The shadows softer, the undergrowth alive with tiny movements and bird call. When he reached the pond's edge, he paused. The willow's reflection rippled slightly in the water, broken here and there by the slow circles of a fish rising to the surface. It struck him how still the rest of the world was, how the air here seemed to carry less weight, as though it had been cleared of all the hurried thoughts and unspoken demands that pressed in on life elsewhere. He sat on a smooth stone near the water, its surface cool beneath his palms. Somewhere deep in the grass behind him, a cricket sang its single-note hymn to the morning. He remembered other mornings, long ago, standing by the fence line on his parents' farm, watching the sun catch on dew-strung webs and feeling even then that the day would be good, simply because it had begun gently. The willow shifted slightly in the breeze, and he thought of how many seasons it must have stood here, bearing witness to the small and quiet lives that passed along its banks. It had seen laughter and sorrow both, had felt the heat of summer afternoons and the brittle cold of winters that turned the pond to glass. Yet it remained, rooted, graceful, unchanged in its devotion to the place it called home. After a time, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. It was worn at the edges, its creases soft from years of being opened and closed. The words on it were few, only a short line in handwriting that was no longer in the world, but they carried the weight of whole conversations, whole seasons of a life shared. He did not read them now. Instead, he let his hand rest over the folded paper, feeling its presence more than its message. Then, almost without thought, he stood and walked to the willow. At its base, where the roots met the soil, he dug a small hollow with his hand and placed the paper inside, covering it again with the soft earth and a few fallen leaves. It was not a gesture of letting go, nor of clinging. It was something quieter, an offering of trust, a way of saying that some memories are safe enough to be left in the care of the earth. The breeze lifted again, and he could swear the branches leaned slightly toward him, as if acknowledging the gift. When he stepped back toward the cabin, he did not rush. He let the morning hold him, let the air carry its cool clarity through him, and felt for the first time in many months that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The cabin had a way of easing him into its rhythm. It was not the kind of place that demanded schedules or hurried tasks. Instead, it seemed to carry its own quiet clock, a measure of time set by the light through the window, by the sound of wind along the porch rail, by the gentle breath of the pond just beyond the trees. After breakfast, a simple meal of bread warmed on the stove and a slice of last autumn's preserved apples. Thomas stepped outside and let the morning light rest on his face. It was not yet high enough to burn away the coolness in the air, but its warmth was coming like a slow tide. He could hear the faint creak of the willow's branches, and in that sound was a kind of welcome. He found himself taking to small chores, not from necessity, but because they seemed to belong to the life of this place. A loose shutter on the cabin side was given a new hinge. The steps down to the pond path were cleared of the leaves that had settled in the corners. He mended a bit of the fence near the garden, pressing each nail in with care, as though the boards themselves remembered the hands that had built them long ago. Between tasks, he would pause, leaning on the handle of a rake or sitting on the porch rail, and simply watch the day. There was an ease to doing nothing in particular here, the kind of stillness that in other places might feel like idleness, but here became its own quiet work. Sometimes he would walk to the pond without purpose, just to see how the light was moving across the water that hour. The willow's branches seemed to change their voice with the breeze, a soft hush when the wind was low, a deeper murmur when it picked up as though speaking in a language older than memory. Once, he sat at the base of the tree and noticed how the roots broke through the soil, twisting gently into the earth like the hands of an elder folded in thought. Between those roots, tiny flowers had taken hold, white and delicate, almost unnoticed unless you bent low to see them. They seemed to belong there, like small notes in a longer song. He began keeping a little basket near the door. Throughout the day, he would add to it a few smooth stones from the pond's edge, a sprig of wild mint from near the fence, a feather that had drifted down onto the porch, not to collect for their own sake, but to remember that each day had its own gifts if you looked slowly enough. As the sun lowered in the sky, the shadows stretched long across the clearing, pulling the gold out of the air. Thomas would light the oil lamp inside the cabin, its glow settling into the corners like a warm breath. He would make tea and sit in the rocking chair, the sound of the willow outside blending with the steady creak of the chair's old joints. In these evenings, there was no sense of arrival or departure. Only the soft unfolding of another day lived at the pace of the land. He thought often of the world beyond the pond, the places where clocks ruled and roads roared, and it felt like a memory from another life. Here, under the steady watch of the willow, he was beginning to understand that rest was not something to be snatched in the gaps between obligations. It was a way of being, a choice to let the small good things stand in the light. And so, with the pond just beyond the darkening window and the willow leaning into the night air, Thomas let the day end the way it had begun. With stillness, the days had begun to take on a quiet symmetry. Morning drifted into afternoon, and afternoon into the golden hush of evening, as naturally as breath moving in and out. It was not the sameness of routine that Thomas felt, but the comfort of a pattern, like the familiar grain of a well-worn table, or the way a friend's voice softens at the edges when telling you something meant only for you. Each morning, the mist would lift from the pond as if reluctant to leave. It curled around the willow's lower branches, letting go in slow strands until the water below shone clear again. Thomas would watch from the porch with a mug of tea, his hands wrapped around the heat, letting the day begin in its own time. Some mornings he would walk down to the water before the sun broke over the hill. the grass cool and damp beneath his boots. The path was becoming more familiar under his feet, the way it dipped slightly near the fence line, the soft patch of moss just before the willow's roots. He began to think of these small details as if they were people, steadfast companions who greeted him without words. By late morning, he might be tending to the garden. The rows were simple, beans just beginning to climb, carrots hidden deep in the soil, a small scatter of marigolds planted more for the pleasure of color than for any practical purpose. He would pause often, leaning on the handle of the hoe, and watch how the clouds moved across the pond, their shadows stretching and folding like blankets being laid down. In the afternoons, Thomas found himself drawn to the far side of the pond, a place he had rarely visited before. The ground there sloped gently to a cluster of reeds, and if he stood still enough, he could see fish moving just beneath the surface, their tails making slow silver arcs in the shallows. It was here that he discovered a fallen branch from the willow, half in the water, half on the shore, its bark worn smooth by years of wind and rain. He ran his hand along it, feeling the grooves and ridges, and thought about how even what had been broken could still belong. As evening came, the air would take on that subtle change, not colder exactly, but more deliberate. The pond mirrored the sky, and the first stars appeared like faint promises kept. Thomas would light the lamp in the cabin, the glass warm against his palm, as he carried it to the small table by the window. Its glow spilled out onto the porch boards, where moths circled in quiet, patient orbits. He found himself thinking less about the life he had left behind, and more about the life that was quietly forming here. Not the kind built on plans and deadlines, but the kind that grew out of showing up each day, paying attention, and letting the hours do their gentle work. The pond didn't rush to become anything other than itself. The willow did not force its branches to reach higher than the wind allowed, and Thomas slowly was learning to move the same way. Sometimes in the stillness before sleep, he would remember faces from years past, neighbors, friends, the soft voice of someone who had once known him well. Their presence would pass through him like the evening breeze through the willow's leaves, felt but not held too tightly. He had begun to understand that such memories did not ask to be resolved, only carried with care. On this night, as he stood by the window, watching the pond settle into its dark reflection of the sky, Thomas thought of how many lives the willow had seen. Its roots sunk deep in the soil had felt the weight of decades, maybe centuries, and still it stood, not as a monument, but as a companion to the quiet work of days. He blew out the lamp, letting the darkness fill the cabin in soft folds. Outside, the willow swayed once in the night air, as if to acknowledge his presence before the wind carried its voice away. And Thomas, lying in his bed beneath the faint scent of wood smoke and old cedar, let himself drift into the unhurried rest that this place seemed to offer so freely. There are evenings when the world seems to pause, as though the air itself has decided to stand still and listen. On this evening, Thomas felt that pause settle around the pond. The water held the last light of the day like a secret, and the willow leaned ever so slightly toward its own reflection, as though meeting an old friend. He had walked the familiar path slowly, each step deliberate, his boots brushing against the long grass that leaned in from both sides. The air smelled faintly of earth after a light rain, that quiet green scent that speaks more of beginnings than endings. By the time he reached the willow, The sun had already slipped below the western ridge. What remained was not the fading of day, but the rising of evening. The light was softer now, turning the pond into a mirror of blues and silvers, and making the willow's leaves shimmer like small coins drifting in an unseen current. Thomas rested his hand on the rough bark. It was cool beneath his palm, the ridges and lines telling a story far older than his own. He didn't need to know the details of that story. The seasons of growth and loss, the storms weathered, the years of standing through frost and heat. It was enough to know that the willow was still here, rooted deep and leaning into the wind without fear. He lowered himself to the grass, sitting where the earth curved gently toward the water. The pond was so still that the sky above seemed doubled, stars beginning to spark both overhead and beneath his feet. Somewhere far off, a night bird called, its voice carrying across the open fields. It wasn't a sound that asked for a reply. It was simply a note in the quiet music of the place. Thomas thought of the first morning he had stood here, when the mist had been thick and the willow's shape only a shadow. He thought of how much he had not known then, how much he still did not know now, and how strangely freeing that was. Life here didn't require him to have the answers. It only asked that he show up, to watch the light change, to listen when the wind spoke through the leaves, to walk the same path again and again until it felt like part of him. The breeze shifted, carrying with it the scent of the wild mint growing near the far bank. It mingled with the faint sweetness of the willow leaves, and for a moment Thomas closed his eyes, letting the fragrance sink into him the way a lullaby settles into the quiet before sleep. In the deepening dusk, the first fireflies appeared. They hovered near the grass, each one blinking in its own time. Their lights neither hurried nor late, just arriving when they were meant to. Thomas watched them without trying to count, knowing that some things were not meant to be measured. When the last of the daylight was gone, he rose and placed his palm once more on the willow's trunk. There were no words, just a small nod, as one might give a friend before parting for the night. The willow's branches shifted, slightly in the dark, a movement so subtle it could have been the wind or something more. The path back to the cabin felt shorter now. The lamp in the window glowed like a steady heart, casting its warm circle across the porch boards. Inside, the air held the lingering warmth of the small stove, the scent of wood and tea and the day's quiet work. Thomas sat for a long while in the chair by the window, watching the pond turn completely to shadow until even its outline blended into the night. It was a darkness that held no fear, only the deep rest of a place at peace with itself. When at last he lay down, he could still hear the faint whisper of leaves beyond the glass, a sound that wove itself into his breathing. The pond, the willow, the slow turning of the night, all of it seemed to keep watch, holding him gently in the quiet center of things. And as sleep came, he carried with him the certainty that tomorrow would arrive not with noise, but with the same soft unfolding as today. The mist rising from the water, the path waiting beneath his feet, and the willow standing by the pond, rooted in time, steady as the heart of the land itself. And so, as the night folds itself gently around us, we leave the willow and the quiet pond in the care of the stars. The air outside is cool and still, and somewhere in that stillness, the branches sway in a rhythm older than memory. A reminder that the world can be soft, and that you too can rest here without hurry. May your mind be light, your breathing steady, and your dreams as calm as the water beneath the moon. If you've been carrying the weight of the day, let it slip from your shoulders now, and know that you are safe, you are cared for, and the night will keep watch until morning comes. When you wake, I hope you carry a small piece of this quiet with you. And before you drift away completely, I'd love to hear from you. What story would you like me to tell next? Leave your thoughts gently in the comments below, and perhaps together we'll wander there in our next night's journey.